This chapter is going to deal with the origins of rhythm. So we are now at the start of Unit 3 in Chapter 9. The entire unit covers quite a few different concepts that are all related to the performance of music. So in Chapter 9, we're going to talk about the origins of rhythm very briefly. In Chapter 10, we're going to talk about performance indicators. These are the symbols and terms that are used by musicians to understand how to interpret and perform a new musical work. In Chapter 11, you're going to start to learn officially how to count rhythms. If you've been performing the daily routines and the other exercises, the rhythm sets in your course, then your instructor has likely been teaching you about some of these concepts already. But in Chapter 11, we officially start to deal with these concepts and go a little more in depth into rhythm and how you can use it to learn to count and read new musical works. In Chapter 12, we're going to deal with the different types of time signatures. We're not going to get into some of the more complex time signatures, but you will learn the most common time signatures in music. In Chapter 13, you'll also learn how to classify those time signatures. We can group time signatures into various categories based on their characteristics. You will learn those categories and how to group them yourself. In Chapter 14, we're going to deal with tempo. So there's a lot that actually goes into tempo in music, and there are certain terms that are important for you to learn in order to understand tempo better. So here's an overview of Chapter 9. These are the concepts you should fully understand by the end of this chapter. You need to have a basic understanding of where rhythm originated from. You should understand how barlines and measures work to separate the different units of time in music. You should also understand the concept of the beat or pulse in music, and you should learn about the natural accents that exist in music. So let's start with the oldest known musical instruments. The oldest instruments known are the flute, and these were initially made of bird bone and mammoth ivory. Today we make them out of all kinds of material, including silver and various alloys, to provide the best sound. The first flute that we have on record, as of the time of this recording, is 42,000 to 43,000 years old, and there's a picture of what that flute looks like in the lower right hand corner. Scientists figured out how old that flute was based on carbon dating. So music may have served a practical purpose before the development of language. It, many scientists believe, was used in communication before we actually developed our ability to speak. Scientists also believe that it's linked to the establishment of monogamy. That makes a lot of sense. If you listen to a piece that you haven't heard in a few years, it takes you back to the last time when you heard that piece. So with music come certain memories of the events that occurred while you were listening to that piece for the first or second time, or any memorable moment where you listen to that piece, you'll remember it. So music can serve as a way to jog the memory of old events and pastimes. Music is also believed to provide a social glue that helps to bond societies. So if you have two different tribes that never see each other, both tribes are going to develop their own language and their own music for the culture. And so if a member from the other tribe suddenly comes across the new tribe, or the other tribe, then it's a pretty simple way of identifying that that person isn't part of the tribe. They won't recognize any of the music because they learned a completely different set of songs and rhythms and other elements that they use to help make their tribe their own. So it's a way of sort of identifying an outside member from a culture. So here's a larger image of that flute, just to give you an idea of what it looked like. You'll notice there's a large hole that was likely the mouthpiece. That was the part that the performer would actually blow into. And then the other two holes would be used to make the instrument effectively longer or shorter, which could change the pitch of the instrument. Okay, So now we're going to talk about bar lines and measures. This is a pretty simple concept, but a very important one. Musicians use bar lines to break musical notation up into smaller segments of time. This makes it easier for a musician to follow along with the music. If you didn't have bar lines and you just had a whole series of notes that were played, then it could get very confusing as to where you actually are in the music. So we just use bar lines to divide music up into smaller segments of time. And usually those segments of time are going to be equal. You can think of it this way. If the distance between two bar lines is 2 seconds, in most pieces, the distance between all the bar lines will be 2 seconds. So look at the first example. You see an image of a bar line. There's a staff system with the 5 horizontal lines, and then the bar line is a single vertical line that comes down through the center of the staff system. Now, if you look at the next example, the measure is the space between the 2 bar lines. So in this example, you actually have 4 different measures. You can count them. 1, 2, 3, 4. And what we would do as musicians is you put notes in between those bar lines, and you make sure that those notes add up to a certain value. And the way you determine the value is based on how much each note is worth, which is something we'll get into in a later chapter. But for now, just know that the space between 2 bar lines is called a measure. So you should know what a bar line looks like and what a measure looks like. So the beat is a steady, recurring pulse in music. It's the pulse that makes it possible to tap your foot along or dance while listening to music. The beat can be felt instinctively when listening to a piece of music, but sometimes the beat can be hard to identify. For the most part, it's going to be the steady recurring pulse that you feel within your body. You might start tapping your foot, or if you're dancing, it might be the rhythm you use to dance, as long as it's a steady rhythm. It's generally possible to identify the beat of a piece by listening for an accent at the beginning of each measure. In the excerpt below, the first beat of each measure should have a slight accent that helps to identify when each measure begins. So that first clef you see there is a treble clef. The clef below it is actually a percussion clef. The treble clef, as we know, identifies pitched instruments, and it allows performers to play specific pitches. The percussion staff doesn't deal with pitch. Instead, it simply deals with non-pitched instruments, and you'll generally see that laid out as a single line, where you just have notes that indicate the rhythm. So if you were to sing this, one of the first things you would do if you want to sight sing this is you keep a steady pulse going in your mind. If you look at the percussion staff, all I'm going to do is I'm going to clap each one of those dark notes in a steady, recurring tempo. So it would sound like this. You notice how the first beat is always just a little bit louder than the second beat. So now we can sing the melody along with it. Are you sleeping? Are you sleeping? Brother John, Brother John. So that tempo allows me to determine how long to hold each note. You see the black notes line up with other black notes, and then in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, the 6th measure, where we land on the word John, you see there's a note that is not filled in. It's got a hollow center, but it still has a stem. Judging from the rhythm below it, you can tell that we hold that particular note for 2 beats. So this is a way to determine how you count music, which we're going to get into a little more detail later. But for now, you should understand this basic concept that the beat is something that recurs regularly, and it can help us to identify the time signature of a piece. So go ahead and look at this and try and count how many measures are in the excerpt. Now you're actually going to have two possible answers depending on whether you want to use systemic bar lines or regular bar lines. So if you look at the far left of this example, you see a bar line that connects the treble and the percussion staff. We call that a systemic bar line because it connects a system of measures. So you've got a treble clef and a percussion clef that are both connected and played at the same time. The regular bar lines would be counted by counting all the bars in the treble clef and then all the bars in the percussion clef. So take a second to figure out the answers for both systemic bar lines and regular bar lines, and then let's see if you got it right. So if you said there are 9 systemic bar lines, you'd be correct. You have to double that for the regular bar lines. So that gives us a total of 9 measures if we're just counting the systemic bar lines, or 18 measures if you're counting every measure in the piece. So how often does a main beat occur? Since the entire piece is going to be played at the same time, where you've got the percussion staff and the treble clef staff both playing together, then it's going to be the number of times you have a downbeat. So you've got 1 downbeat in the first measure, 1 in the second, 1 in the third, the fourth, the fifth, the 6th, the 7th, and the 8th. There isn't a beat in measure 9, so the answer here would be 8. So just a note, the notes in the percussion staff should be tapped at a regular interval. This makes it possible to identify the main beat within the composition. It also allows us to learn how to count the melody and perform it with the correct rhythm. One activity you can do on your own is get your textbook and find this excerpt. And then get a watch with the second hand and tap your foot at the rate of 1 note per second. Now attempt to sing the melody above while keeping the beat steady. And what that means is keeping your foot tapping at the rate of 1 note per second. Now sing the melody again, but tap your foot to indicate the steady beat in the percussion staff while you sing the melody from memory. That's something you should try and do with all of your exercises, is you should try and memorize, if you're working on the sight singing with your instructor, you should try and memorize every one of those melodies. It's really important to develop your sense of musical memory and to help you learn how to phrase properly. These are concepts I talk about in more detail in the ear training guide. So if you haven't watched that, you should go and listen to the ear training guide now or after you finish this lecture. The last thing we're going to talk about in this chapter are natural accents. So there are several beats in a typical measure, but some beats are intended to be played with a harder accent than others. The most accented beat in each measure typically occurs on the first beat. This is something I've talked about already, so you should understand this concept. So in this example below, the first note of each measure should have the hardest accent, and it shouldn't be a really strong accent, but it should be a very subtle sinking in of the note to indicate that this is the first beat of the measure and this is how this piece is progressing in terms of its pulse and accent. The remaining beats have lighter accents, so this helps give the piece a sense of forward motion. If you think about a train rhythmically going along the tracks, it has a consistent sound to the wheels as it's moving and as the train moves across all the slats in the railroad. So that's kind of similar to how music works, because with music, once you start, you don't stop. Music is really a time art. So in order to make it feel like the piece is going somewhere and to feel like the melodies have structure, what we do is we create this system of strong followed by lighter accents to give the piece a sense of form and forward motion, to feel like it's actually going towards a goal. And the other thing you should know is that a piece can have numerous beats in a single measure, but measures with 2, 3, and 4 beats are the most commonly found. And we're going to talk about this in more detail later. But for now, you should just understand this concept that music has accents, natural accents that we find, and they're usually based on the time signature. So if you hear a piece where it sounds like there's a heavy accent every other beat, you're probably in 2/4. If you hear an every accent only every 3 beats, then you're probably in 3/4. If you hear an accent every 4 beats with a weaker accent somewhere in the middle there on beat 3, then that's probably in 4/4. So this is just to prep you for a discussion on time signatures, which will come a little bit later in this unit.